Just like the street lights lit this town, like a fire in a blaze, gotta burn it down.
All right, here we are, folks.
Can't be afraid to leave this out. We got this far, don't know how. I see danger in your eyes. They know we'll burn down the night. Coming just like the sunrise. You know that we're gonna light it up tonight. We're gonna light it up tonight. We're gonna light it up just like the sunrise. We're gonna light it up.
Welcome back once again. This is Chris Report, and he assured me that since I'm down in Boulders, folks, this is Chris Wyatt reporting from South Africa. Hello, folks, and welcome back to Chris Wyatt Reports here on the Daba Africa channel. It's Chris live in central Pennsylvania for a much anticipated broadcast, but one that, owing to 13th century technology in Eastern Europe, we've had to postpone. And I believe that as a consequence, not a lot of people realize that we're doing this right now. But first, let me just do some housekeeping before we get started and introduce my guest today. I want to thank those who stuck with this program through the censorship, the unwarranted nonsense that took place on this platform and others starting in 2021 after January 6th, and continued with the destruction of my original channel that had grown from 2 subscribers to 23,000 in just 5 months with so much viewing going on. This channel now is 3 years old, slightly over that, and we finally, last night, surpassed the 15,000 subscriber mark. Wow, it's good to be back at that level. Frankly, we should be at 2 or 3 million at this point, but it's disappointing. But nonetheless, thank you all if we stuck with the program. For those who found us recently and those who've rediscovered us, a lot of people apparently are rediscovering us as YouTube eases up on its algorithm attacking conservatives. At least that's the appearance. But thanks for being here. And speaking of conservatives, I have a couple conservatives with me today. This is truly an international broadcast. We've got János, who's in Hungary. I believe he's in Budapest, if I'm not mistaken. And then we've also got Ernst Roets, who many South Africans know, formerly with AfriForum, now with the Solidarity Movement. Let me start with János. János, I don't speak any Hungarian. All I know is Pizza Hut in Budapest. So I'll greet you in English. How are you today?
Oh, hi. I'm doing great. It's already 3 o'clock here, just like in South Africa. So I've already worked one day through today. You've just woken up, so it's always interesting to see. Well, I assume you just woke up. I mean, you sleep at night.
That would be an assumption. I've been up since 5 a.m.
Okay. I'm not up since 5 a.m. I only get up at 5 a.m. when my neighbor starts watering the garden at 5 a.m. and unfortunately sometimes pushes the pump against my wall, so the whole concrete fence resonates into the house. But yeah, so yeah, by the way, just to add, for the postponement, the European Union stated that Romania apparently has got the best internet cell phone network. Well, we saw how that worked when we tried to do the broadcast. So right now I'm on the Hungarian cell phone network. It seems to work much better.
Yeah, well, a lot of things seem to work much better in Hungary these days, and we're grateful for that. Also with us is Ernst Roets, whom I've met many times, also interviewed him. Listen, Ernst, you are back in South Africa after a tour of Europe, which included a trip to Hungary, Romania, and I think maybe even Yugoslavia. Oops, sorry, that doesn't exist anymore, to Serbia. Yeah. So how's it going to Hungary?
Dat gaat baie goed. Thank you very much. Well, when you said Yugoslavia for a moment, I thought you were talking about Belgium, but then I realized you were talking about Serbia. So,
well, one can be excused for thinking that in Brussels you are in fact in Yugoslavia with all the former Yugoslav, South Slavs who live in that part of the world. But anyway.
Yeah, so I made, just to add to that, during János was there, we had a video we played at one point where there was a Freudian slip. We accidentally, instead of saying European Union, we said Soviet Union. And it was a great source of amusement to some of the people who were there, who who said they find it a very appropriate Freudian slip. So,
well, I'm honestly, I can understand that. I mean, Moscow, totalitarian fascist rule over its satellite states. Brussels, totalitarian fascist rule over its satellites. Oh, did I say that out loud? I said that out loud.
Yeah.
So, Ernst, what was the purpose of your trip to Europe this time? What were you going there to do?
Yeah, so we were there for 3 weeks. I just got back over the weekend in South Africa, and the first week we were in Belgium, in Brussels, and we attended the notorious NatCon conference that the mayor tried to shut down with the police, which was something bizarre to witness because that type of thing doesn't happen in South Africa. South Africa has a lot of problems, but I've never seen police showing up to shut down a conference because the mayor doesn't like what he said inside. So that was one part of it. Then we had some meetings and networking and things like that around the conference. We spoke with some of our friends in Flanders and so forth. We then went to Hungary, where we spent a week. We had so much going on in Hungary. We released a documentary film called Boers in Carpathia. Carpathia, of course, referring to the Carpathian Basin, where Hungary is, and where Transylvania is as well. We released a book called Relations Between Afrikaners and Hungarians, which is a very, very interesting book about the very unknown history of cooperation between the Afrikaner people and the Hungarian people. We attended CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, where I was a speaker, one of the participants. I will upload my panel discussion on which I participated on my channel soon. And then we had this Transylvania trip, which János, who's with us today, did most of the work for, to get all the logistics done. And it was an incredible trip to meet with the minority communities in Romania, especially the Hungarian minorities, where we also had a conference, an international minority rights conference in Sepsi St. George. I hope I'm pronouncing it right.
Yeah, you're getting it. You're getting it.
I'm almost there. Or Spencer, Georgia, as it is called on Apple Maps. We had an international conference about minority rights, where I spoke, János spoke as well, and some other speakers. And then we deliberately went back through Serbia, because we wanted to see the border, the notorious or the infamous Hungarian southern border. And I'm really happy that we were able to do this, and also that János was able to arrange for us to meet people at the border to talk to us about their experience living in Serbia, the northern parts of Serbia during this Hungarian crisis, and what they saw happening at the border. And it was really shocking. So other than our outputs, in other words, the stuff that we did, speaking at CPAC, the conference and so forth, which was really great, the input was also very great. In other words, what we saw and what we experienced and what we learned about history and about what's happening in the world. It was really, really a beneficial journey for us.
Well, we should probably inform some of our viewers. I'll do that myself as a historian and also a historian of the region about a little of the kaleidoscope we're talking about here. Romania in particular is a country full of many different ethnic minorities, ethnic groups. You've got Hungarians, millions of Hungarians. You've also got what's left of the ethnic Germans who are there. You've got the Roma. You've got a whole Moldovians. You've got a whole host of folks and others who have been there who've been since kicked out of the country. And for Hungarians themselves, Hungarians lived in a much larger space than what is the modern Hungary. Hundreds of thousands used to live in the northern part of what is Serbia today. And then also
They still do. We just met them.
Well, yes, but there were more. There were even more.
Yeah, there were more, obviously.
There were more. And there are still a few million Hungarians, ethnic Hungarians, living in what is Romania today. But it's a region that for long it's a lot more than Dracula, than people think about when they think of the area. But of course, Transylvania was settled around 1,000 years ago by ethnic Germans who were invited down by a Hungarian king to defend against the Ottoman Turks who were encroaching into Europe, and they were given special rights and allowed to build their own communities, which were exclusive to Germans. In fact, when you talk about the pronunciation, I'm because as a researcher for ethnic Germans, I'm stuck on the German name. So Brasov is not Brasov to me; it's Kronstadt, and Sibiu is not Sibiu; it's Schesburg. And then you've got Hermannstadt, which is what's that one anyway? But my point is that so the Germans had these ethnic communities, and for instance, in Kronstadt, the Hungarians, there weren't many Hungarians there, but the Romanians and the Roma and others could only come into the town on market day on the weekend. The rest of the time it was occupied by Germans. If you go to Brasov today, you'll look at the World War I Austro-Hungarian Empire's cemetery on the edge of the center of town, and virtually every single surname is a Germanic name from the Germans who lived there dying in the First World War. Anyway, that's a little bit about the East, and we're going to shift a little bit here. So that's about your trip. You did a conference up there. You went to CPAC. That's pretty interesting. You know, Ernst, we have a lot of cross linkages here for things we haven't done together, but we've done. You've been to CPAC. János has been to CPAC. I've been to CPAC down in Florida when it moved from Maryland. We've all been to Eastern Europe. Of course, János is from Eastern Europe. He lives there. Or it's kind of more like Central Europe if you look at things objectively.
Well, really Hungary, you don't see it culturally as Eastern Europe because it's part of the Western culture. It was just occupied by the Soviets for 50 years of the history. If you look up a history atlas from anything before 1945, Hungary is classified as Central Europe.
That's what I was just saying. It's more of a Central Europe than Eastern Europe thing. But it fell behind the Iron Curtain, as once described by Winston Churchill. Now, János, you've got a background there. It looks like what's left of some medieval church. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what that's all about? Because this is where we were meant to do this live broadcast, but at 2 kilobytes per day of data throughput, we really couldn't pull it off.
Yeah, so obviously we just got to know what the Europe's best mobile network works like. But anyway, the place is, well, actually it's the place where my ancestry comes from. It's called Bezuidenhout. Now, the interesting thing about the village is that it had 6 denominations living side by side in peace. These were the Roman Catholics, the Calvinists, the Unitarians, the Orthodox, the Greek Catholics, and the Jewish people. You had them living side by side in peace. And, well, in the 1980s, Ceausescu's communist Romania decided, well, we need to get rid of villages in general. Now, why do they want to get rid of villages? If you move people into apartment buildings, it's much easier to control them. Now, everybody who says when I talk about this or write papers about how it affected minorities, they say, yeah, but it also happened in places which were not inhabited by minorities. Just for the record, this village Bezuidenhout was inhabited all by Hungarians, even though they were all of different religions. Now, in the place, you had like a very unique culture because many of the people following Jewish faith weren't actually of Jewish forefathers, but were of Hungarian ancestry. This intermingled a little bit, but this was the original case. Now, what happened is the Kishmed, which is the river running through the village, or was the river running through the village, often had floods. So the Romanian government decided in 1975 to build a dam to try and stop the floods on the bottom part of the river. This would have been fine. It would have destroyed 3 houses in the village, no problem. But then, and they would have rebuilt this in another place, these 3 houses. The village still would have remained intact. I mean, obviously, it's not nice for the people who have to be moved, but it's much easier to be moved a few streets up than moved somewhere else. And in 1985, Ceausescu said we have to go forward with the systematization program. Now, this was the most well-known one. There were over 400 villages destroyed, over 100 flooded. The reason why this is well-known, because up until today, on every first Saturday of August, the village meetings are held at the side of the lake. Now, the reason why it is more detrimental to minorities, if you move a minority and a lingual minority into a city, into apartment blocks, they lose their language, lose their culture much quicker than the majority. And, well, obviously this village doesn't want to die off. So you can see the church in the background. It's actually not a medieval church. The church was sticking out of the water until 2014 when it collapsed. And the community of the village decided to rebuild the church on the water on big concrete pillars. So we couldn't actually go into the church because the bridge hasn't been built yet to bridge over that wet area. I've been in during construction, but when we were there with Ernst, we couldn't go inside. And it's only really the church tower that's being built. And starting on the 3rd of August this year, every noon the bells will be rung, just to remind everybody that there was a village. So this is what happens when you have communism, because obviously the concept is, well, how do we control the people the best? If we strip them of their identity, they can't nourish themselves, because don't forget, Romania had a food shortage. And the way people got around it was to grow crops in their garden in the 1980s. And when they were moved into these apartment blocks, all they could do is what the government gave you. You could stand in a long queue, and you could take your food stamps and buy food for it. That didn't mean you got it for free. That still meant you had to buy it for money, but you had these stamps, or these coupons, which gave you permission to buy a certain amount of food.
Perhaps
so this is what they're going on.
Go ahead, János.
Okay.
Okay, so you finished. Sorry. Yeah, no. Perhaps one of the great tragedies here is that the actions of Nicolae Ceausescu were aided and abetted by Western authorities as a consequence of his opposition to Soviet. He was kind of poked the Soviets in the eye. So for years, the Western countries lent credit to Romania and allow them to take these actions because they were a bulwark in the eyes of Western political leaders against the Soviets. And this was exacerbated by the fact that at one point, if you go back to when Romania became a modern state after the First World War, there were over 1 million ethnic Germans in Romania out of a population of 8 million. So about 1 out of 8 people were Germans, and about 2 million plus of those were Hungarian at the time. That population became larger. But the ethnic Germans had, of course, were shipped off to the Gulag and to work in slave factories after the Second World War by the Soviets. But they weren't the only ones. They also took Hungarians and Romanians, but they took a huge percentage of the German population. But the population recovered for a number of years until the 1980s, when the West German government paid exit visas of 12,000 Deutschmarks to Ceausescu's government for about a decade to allow ethnic Romanians to repatriate to Germany, places where these people had never lived and their family had lived in Eastern Europe for 1,000 years. But they raised hard currency, and that allowed Ceausescu to continue these actions. And he had all kinds of bizarre actions. Destroyed the architecture of central Bucharest with his massive, hideous-looking Soviet-esque buildings that they constructed, and wiping out 400 villages, as you mentioned. It's insane what the communists did, and they especially targeted minorities because they had no stake in the government. Ernst, how did you guys come up with this topic and decide to go after this? Because you're focused on minority rights, is that what did it? And you're looking at perhaps a classic case of what not to do when minorities are involved?
Yes, so we've I went to Hungary for the first time in 2021. And we noticed instantly how much we have in common with the Hungarians, especially the fact that the Hungarians are Christian people, they are conservative, they have their own language, their own culture, and they wish to cherish that, and they don't mind going upstream, and they get bad press and all of that. And we've been speaking with János. János is grew up in South Africa, but he is a Hungarian, we started taking notice about, we learned about the Trianon Treaty, where Hungary lost two-thirds of its territory after the First World War. Of course, the photo in the background used to be part of the Greater Hungary, you might say. And it was really shocking. So we wanted to go, obviously we had the conference in Transylvania that we went to speak at, but also to learn a bit about the history and to witness these things. And János mentioned this, but I just want to repeat that because it's really significant that there was this war that was waged on villages, especially in Romania, and it was between 450 and 500 villages were destroyed. About 100 of them were flooded. Now, so in other words, what we see in the background there, a village flooded and just the church tower sticking out, that's just 1 out of 100 such examples. And it seems like something from a dystopian novel, some future science fiction novel, Brave New World or 1984 or something. But this actually happened, and it didn't happen in isolated cases. And I mean, we knew, of course, that Mao tried to do such things, and also that the Romanians, the communists in Romania, actually got this from Maoist China. But then the question is why? Why was it so important to wage war on the villages? And I think both of you mentioned the issue of control, which was certainly one of it. I think another aspect is the whole point of authority, because communism seeks to convince communism only tolerates its own authority, and any other source of authority has to be rejected by the communists. And that, of course, is why the communists were so aggressively atheistic, trying to destroy religion, waging war on the churches, and so forth. And in villages, also people tend to be more conservative. They tend to to value their cultures and their tradition, and it's more difficult to control such people if they have a particular affinity for where they come from, and they value their communal identity. And so one way to destroy this source of authority, in other words, the authority that is vested in tradition and culture and so forth, is just to destroy the villages and move the people to the cities, have forced them to go and live in those. I still try to understand how it's possible to build such ugly buildings. It's even if you have to really try to make a building as ugly as some of those buildings that we saw, and to force them to live there. And we were told by the locals there also that they would be dispersed. So you would move into a flat or an apartment block with a bunch of people you don't know, and some of them would be informers for the government. So if you did something, or if you criticized the government would know about that. And that's how they destroyed local cultures and local communities, or at least tried their best to do so.
Well, you know, another tragedy of this whole ridiculous clown car show that was Nicolae Ceausescu was his demand that the population increase. And so they made abortion illegal. Not that I have an issue with abortion not being a legal situation, but the point was they wanted women to reproduce. And this led to poor medical conditions and a resulting of so many Romanian children being abandoned, and a lot of them with HIV. I think a lot of people have forgotten about the HIV crisis in Romania, of all places. Why Romania? We're aware of it in Southern Africa, we're aware of it in India, and we're aware of it in the gay community in the Western world. But Romania was a spot, and of course the Haitian was another situation, but that was sex tourism. So why there? Well, it's because of the nonsense that Ceausescu went after here. I mean, frankly, what we're talking about here with the destruction of these villages, with herding people up and taking them into places where they're just basically serfs. I mean, that's the intent here. They've destroyed millennia of culture, millennia of architecture. And this, I mean, by all intents and purposes, one could argue that the actions of the Ceausescu regime were crimes against humanity. Would you agree or disagree with that, János?
I would agree with it. Now, obviously, since I come from a village originally that was destroyed, I have to double agree with it. Now, the thing is that when you have a village that's been destroyed for 50 years and the people still hold a village meeting, you can see how important it is for the people, that place. And actually, in 1988, there was a protest in Budapest against this destruction of villages, where the statement explicitly stated that it's against the United Nations Convention of forced removal of people from their place of residence. So because this is exactly what happened, is before you destroy the village, you take the person and you move them out. And you give them all sorts of promises, which doesn't happen. Now, let me just for sake of business we follow, let me just give you an example. They got, if I remember correctly, 35,000 lei for a house in an excellent condition. Now, Aaron saw that red house, that was the house of my relatives, that's already collapsing after 50 years, but it was a huge 2-story house. They got 55,000 leis. Now, the cost of a used Dacia was 70,000 leis back then. Now, Dacia isn't exactly a very good car as far as I'm concerned. I wouldn't buy one, because we probably wouldn't have made it all the way last week if we would have been driving a Dacia. Probably had to stop at some service point or something. It's especially, I'm not talking about the modern Dacia. I'm talking about the one that was before 1989. I'm talking about that one. So if anybody has got a modern Dacia, that's a different story. But what we're talking about is another story. So basically, they gave you nothing. They got permission to tear down their houses and rebuild it somewhere else if they can buy property. Now, why is this important? In Romania, in the 1980s, it was illegal for you to build your own house. It was only the government had the right to build buildings for apartment blocks. Now, just imagine this. You get special permission to tear down your house and use the building materials to build another one. Now, most people didn't even get enough money from this compensation to move the building blocks to another site, never mind buy one. So the only people who managed to rebuild their house someplace else is either they had relatives who left illegally, let's put this in quotation marks because it was illegal to leave the country, so left illegally to the west and somehow brought money back home so they could buy buy a property where they could rebuild the house and move it, or they, for whatever reason, their relatives had another property which they somehow got from their relatives. So it's the only way. And basically, people had to move into relatives' houses if they didn't accept the very bad quality housing that the Romanian government gave them. Now, imagine these apartment blocks the following. You had a communal bathroom and a communal kitchen. And some of these blocks didn't even have doors and windows. So people who did accept the apartments actually took the doors and windows from the old houses in the village to be able to put them into the apartment blocks. Now, the other thing is, in South Africa, you all know about load shedding. Well, Romania did this in the 1980s as well. There's only one big difference. In these apartment blocks, you had district heating, which meant that they used the gas or whatever heat source, could be different as well, to heat the water which they were circulating in these apartment blocks. Now, as soon as power goes out, you can easily imagine that the water circulation went out. Now, there was this joke in Romania that the American and the Romanian meet in the 1980s, and the American tells them, well, you know, our country produces the best cars. What do you have the best of? And then the Romanian says, well, we have the best snow. Why? Well, because if you put it on the heater, it's still there after 2 days. Now, you know, it's just, you know, it's inhumane to basically, you have a country that's in an economic crisis, it's got an energy crisis, you have driving bans in the country because they can't pay for crude oil. You have power cuts because I don't know if it was the fuel for the power plants or if the power plants weren't maintained. I didn't really go into that. I don't know about that. But for whatever reason, you had power cuts. In Transylvania, I mean, I've been on, I remember it was New Year's Day, late in the evening, we were in Chicxereda. It was minus 50 degrees. Now, can you imagine sitting in a place where you don't have heating and minus 50 degrees? It's going to get pretty cold pretty quickly. While in the houses, they still had a stove where they could put firewood in there and heat their house without electricity. In the apartments, they couldn't. So you have this problem, and you still go forth with destroying villages and moving people into apartment blocks. Now, you had 1,300 villages which were designated so-called not be destroyed. These would have been the new agricultural industrial centers, but actually these were destroyed, and I'll tell you why. It's because the original housing that the village had was destroyed, and they built these apartment blocks in the villages. So basically, on paper, the place remained there where it is, but still, they look pretty ugly sometimes. Now, fortunately, they didn't manage to destroy all of them, but you get these very strange places where you have these big apartment blocks, and then you have one or two houses in the middle because the owner was just not prepared to move, so they couldn't tear the house down because he was just sitting in there all day. Now, I agree with the statement that was made by the Hungarian protesters in 1988 in Budapest, where they said, this is a crime against humanity. And by the way, this was the first protest since 1956 in Hungary that was not dispersed by the communist secret police. The reason for that was that they couldn't do anything anymore because, you know, the Soviet Union wasn't financing them. Actually, the communists, I think in 1988, could already see that this is coming to an end, and they were trying to take whatever they can to so-called save their economic powers by taking whatever state-owned property there is and privatizing it for themselves. So they didn't really care about this protest. The Romanian embassy asked them many times to disperse the protest. Now, they still went forward with the destruction of villages, but not to the extent they would have, because you think 400 or 500 is a lot. Well, they wanted to get rid of 23,000.
Yeah, no, that's true. His plans were much larger than what actually panned out. So, you know, let me ask you this question, Ernst, about this. I went to Transylvania in 1998, so it's been a while ago now, and it was a backpacking trip. I was based in Italy, and I took the train, and because of the way the trains were set up in Eastern Europe by the Soviets, so you couldn't escape and link, I had to take this strange path. I went from Italy, I went to Zagreb. From Zagreb, I had to go to Budapest in order to get to Romania. I couldn't get there directly from Zagreb. So from Budapest, took the train. And by the way, Ernst, you know, you speak Afrikaans, and János, of course, speaks Hungarian, but I got to tell you something. Everywhere in the world I've been, including parts of Africa, I can always get by either with my English, my German, my French. Those three usually come in handy. Even strangely enough, in some places, Afrikaans has been helpful, you know, in places you wouldn't think of. But the only place I've been in my entire life where I had absolutely no idea what the heck anything said on a written sign, with the exception of the Pizza Hut, was Hungary in Budapest. I have no idea. That is a language that's related remotely to Estonian and Finnish and Karelian, Finno-Ugric language, anyway, the point of the story I'm getting at here is, so 1998, backpacking, rucksack, staying in people's homes, taking the trains, and boy, the trains were an interesting experience in Transylvania, going through Szesburg to Kronstadt and over to Hermannstadt. Actually rented a car. It wasn't a Dacia. By the way, Dacias today are a little bit different because in 1999, Renault purchased the company and rebuilt their factories. That's why they're not like they were in the Romanians. But Ernst, the question I want to ask you is that it's been a while since I've been there. How remote, how less developed are things? I think we can take a measure from the fact that we couldn't even get a signal on the mobile, but I mean, that happens all around the world. Is it still really underdeveloped? I mean, at the time I was there, they were using Romanian soldiers to dig ditches in 1998 because they had no other employment for them. I mean, is it like taking a step back in time? I mean, you come from South Africa, which has some first world infrastructure that the ANC has yet to destroy that still remains. But what's it like going from South Africa and having been all over the world into Transylvania and Eastern Europe? Are you stepping back in time? What was it like?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not able to answer by comparison because this was my first time in Romania, so I cannot say if it's getting better or worse. I can say in a certain sense the culture shock was worse going to Brussels than going to Romania. So partly because of the conference, I tried to shut down and so forth. But what I can say is the people we spoke with were amazing, really wonderful people. And we could see, we went to quite big cities, and I think it's important. We tend to look at the world map, and you think of the big cities of the world, and you think Paris, Berlin, and New York, and whatever. And when you think Romania, you think Bucharest. But we went to Nagyvarad, to Kolozsvár, and those are really big cities, and they were quite developed. We could see poverty. There was some poverty there. There was some derelict buildings, but there were also some really incredible, beautiful buildings, and especially the old stuff that came from before the communist era, the old statues. We were just blown away by some of the art and architecture that we saw. That was really beautiful. But you can see just going into Romania that it is a country that has suffered. They've and especially the area where we were, Transylvania, the people there have really gone through a rough time. And I cannot say if it's better now or worse, but you can clearly see the history just going into the cities. But that goes for Hungary as well. In Hungary you have these incredibly beautiful buildings. I always say that you can see three ideologies by just looking at the architecture. You can see these liberal buildings, you might say, which are these glass buildings. You just see glass everywhere and you can see through it. And then you have the conservative buildings, which are these incredibly beautiful old architecture, like the Hungarian parliament, the best example. And then you have the communist buildings, which are, again, the ugliest architecture you can imagine. And you see them still. But what's incredible in a place like Budapest is how they are transforming the city, changing you can still see some of those old buildings, but how they are working to change these ugly buildings and to make them beautiful again. That's really beautiful. But I really hope that Romania and Transylvania in particular will go through such a process as well.
Well, of course, Hungary has a long tradition of being a very successful kingdom, and it was merged with Austria at one point, became the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Austrian kings had the title of King of Hungary as well for a long time there. Quite amazing architecture along the river there. And of course, János, Budapest is kind of like Minneapolis, St. Paul. It's actually two cities that became one, right? Buda and Pest. They became one city at some point. Now, Hungary still has some minorities. The Roma are there. Those, of course, they don't know the term, that is the gypsy is a vernacular for a lot of people, or Zigeuner in German. But there are also still some ethnic Germans, a lot of ethnic
the biggest
Germans.
minority.
Is it Roma?
No, the Germans.
Oh, the Germans. Okay. Yeah, the Germans had pretty significant numbers in Hungary for a long time as a consequence of settlement, and also of you had administrators who came over from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and played a role there. But big settlements, particularly in the southwestern part of Hungary. Are Germans still, you say they're the biggest minority, but do they play a role in Hungary these days? I know that one of the descendants of the Habsburg is actually in the European Parliament at one stage and makes Hungary his home. I don't know if that's still the case.
Okay, I didn't hear everything because somehow there was some problem.
You must be back in Transylvania.
Yeah. So I guess if I understood correctly, you asked about the Germans, if they're still there. Yes, but you have more people who call themselves Germans because of their ancestry than the ones who can speak German. Because for whatever reason, in Hungary, you have a lot of Germans who speak Hungarian, but still go around in German folk dresses, sometimes do German dances. And yes, they can actually speak German, but they don't understand them. They understand the language amongst each other, but it's such a strong dialect that if a guy from Germany comes there, they won't understand what the guy's saying. So, I speak German because I learned it in a German environment, and I cannot understand the German spoken by the Germans in Hungarian, but we can speak to each other in Hungarian. The other thing is with the Germans, it's very important that the German people in Hungary are very pro-Hungarian. And now I'm talking about the Germans who live here for generations. I'm not talking about the people who moved in. The people who moved in are also very much pro the current government, because you do have a lot of German pensioners who just can't take the migrant situation in Germany anymore and move to Hungary. But that's a different story, because the definition of a minority in Hungary is a Hungarian citizen who identifies themselves as somebody of being non-Hungarian, but is a descendant of people who have lived in Hungary for generations. So it's not the definition that you're an immigrant. But you see, the thing is with minorities, in Hungary, the numbers of the minorities are very, very small when you compare it to 1.5 or 2 million Hungarians in Transylvania, and 800,000 Hungarians in Slovakia, and 300,000 Hungarians in Serbia, and 200,000 Hungarians or 250,000 in Ukraine. We don't know how much there are left, because we just heard today that according to the official statistics, you had 31,000 people die in the Ukrainian war. The non-official statistics are over 500,000. But the point is that you do have these minorities, and what's interesting is that when you work together with the minorities, this is not just the Germans, it's also, for example, the Polish minority and the Slovene minority in Hungary are very significant, and the Croatian minority in Hungary are very significant. If you work together with them, then you don't have these problems and these tensions as you do, for example, in Romania or especially in Ukraine. And this is the thing that they should just start understanding, is that just respect the minorities. For example, in Hungary, the minorities have their schools. Dual place naming is practiced in both Hungary and all the surrounding countries, fortunately, since communism ended. This is the difference, and not just Hungary, Croatia as well, Slovenia as well, where the governments work together with the minorities. And it's not this question of, well, you guys want autonomy. Well, okay, you can hand it into the parliament, and we're going to vote no without even putting it on the agenda, because this is exactly what happened. I mean, Ernst, you met that speaker, that second speaker at our conference, József Kulcsár. He hands in a law or a proposal for a law every year to the Romanian parliament to give the Hungarians territorial and cultural autonomy. Now, some of the demands are very similar to what the Afrikaners are demanding in South Africa. So, for example, that the government shouldn't interfere in the decision of the school boards as to what the language of tuition is. Theaters should have the right to choose the language of the plays, for example, and also that the local authorities should be able to do your official issues in your own language, and you should get the reply in your own language. Because I mean, right now you can go in Transylvania into an official government office, you can send your proposal in Hungarian, because the other person on the other side of the counter can obviously speak Hungarian, but you'll get the official reply in Romanian. So this is all of their demands. To me, it's very similar to what the Afrikaners are demanding. And this was actually a very interesting point. Now, in Hungary, you can do all this if you're a minority, but the thing is that you don't have these huge minority institutions that, for example, you would need in Transylvania or in South Africa because of the sheer numbers. But I mean, just think about it this way. When Croatia became independent, Hungary signed a bilateral Minority Protection Act of Croatia before they even had the time to acknowledge the fact that Croatia is an independent state. That was 3 days later because you obviously had to report that to the United Nations.
Well, it's interesting you talk about this, and I'll get back to Ernst here in a moment, talk about the affinity between Hungarians and Afrikaners. But before I do that, I think a lot of people that are not familiar with history or don't pay attention to history don't realize just how massive movements of people in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, have been since 1939. Actually, since the end of the First World War, massive numbers of people. I mean, you guys came through Serbia in a region known as the Vojvodina, which is north of the Danube River there. And that region still has approximately, I think, about 500,000 ethnic Hungarians living there in what is Serbia today. But in 1945, there were 600,000 ethnic Germans living there. Of course, they were expelled en masse out of there, and we saw 3.5 million Germans evicted from what's known as the Sudetenland in Bohemia and in what is the Czech Republic today. 13 million ethnic Germans evicted from Eastern Europe in total. And when the Soviets and the Germans had the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they moved a couple 100,000 ethnic Germans who had been for 800 to 1,000 years in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, relocated them into what was Western Poland, and evicted the Poles from there. And this movement of people back and forth, it's astounding how many people have been moved. And so it is important to recognize minority rights in Europe, and it's something that has long been neglected and ignored, I believe, by Europeans in general. Now, Ernst, I want to ask you this question about this affinity between Hungarians and Afrikaners. You stated some similarities in faith and family, also being in a position where Hungarians often find themselves in a minority. János mentioned Slovakia, where there's a minority of Hungarians. I think there's also some still in Ukraine, in the western portion of Ukraine, that has Hungarians as well. So this affinity, is it long existing, or is it something that's recently developed since the end of the Cold War?
Well, this is a very important question, because this is the theme of the book that we released in Hungary now, called Relations Between Afrikaners and Hungarians, 1652 to 2023, written by my colleague at AfriForum, Ilse Nieuwoud. And it's an incredible book to read. We're going to make it available online. I think you can find it on AfriForum's website already. But it was very interesting to notice that the reason why this relationship started was actually through people like János and our friend Andras Kiss, who, after what happened in Hungary, of course, in 1956, there was the Hungarian Revolution, where the Hungarians rose up against communism. And there was this violent clampdown by the Soviets or the communists to suppress this uprising. And as a result, many Hungarians fled or left the country, went all over the world, and a few thousand came to South Africa as well, including, and János must correct me, including János's family and András's family. And so this is the fascinating thing. I just had a conversation about this topic with some of my colleagues at Marula Media here in South Africa about the diaspora and people leaving the country. And it's important to remember that if someone leaves the country, it doesn't mean that they are lost forever. And so this friendship actually started as a result of people like János and András, who went back to Hungary, to their homeland, and having some experience and first-hand experience and knowledge about South Africa, saying, listen, there's a lot that we have in common. We should build this friendship. And so what's fascinating is, first, you mentioned and we mentioned some of the things that we have in common today, but there's actually a very unknown but a very long history between the Afrikaners and the Hungarians. Even going back to the settlement, the early settlement in the Cape, when it was still the Cape of Good Hope, back at the beginning eras, before we were even Afrikaners, or we called ourselves Afrikaners. Hungarians, there were some Hungarians in what is now Cape Town, in that area, and the Tokai area in Cape Town was named after the Tokai region in Hungary. And so the Hungarians were part of South African history from the 1600s, 1700s. Also very important, and we didn't know this. We only discovered this through my colleague, through Ilse's research, before the first Anglo-Boer War. People know about the Anglo-Boer War, but the Anglo-Boer War that people know was actually the second Anglo-Boer War. Before the first Anglo-Boer War, which the Boers won actually against the British Empire, the Afrikaners took particular inspiration from the Hungarian freedom struggle. There were speeches that people made where they said, we need to look at the Hungarian freedom struggle, at people like Kossuth Lajos and János Jeney, and learn from their approach. And then during the second Anglo-Boer War, the more famous one that much of the world know about, there were some Hungarians who came down to South Africa to fight, to take part in this war, some on the English side, but the majority on the Boer side. There was also a Hungarian, and we had a wreath-laying ceremony for him now in Kolozsvár, in Transylvania, a young Hungarian noble called Albert Vash, who came down. He met Paul Kruger in Paris while the war was going on, and he was so inspired by the story of the Boers that he took some of his friends and they came down to South Africa to fight for the Afrikaners' freedom. And he was tragically killed in this war. And we were not even aware of this, that there's a memorial for him up in Kolozsvár in Transylvania. We only discovered this very recently. A Hungarian who came down, who fought and died for the freedom of the Afrikaner people. And so we did this wreath-laying ceremony, which was very important to us. Even after the second Anglo-Boer War, some of the Afrikaner leaders, Jan Smuts and Louis Botha, who were involved with the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, were critical of the Trianon Treaty, who supported the Hungarians there. And throughout, during the time of the Hungarian Revolution, the Afrikaners had a program called Adopt a Hungarian Family to help the Hungarians who were fleeing communism. And so it's this fascinating history that's not really well known, and I'm really happy that this book was published, because it's a part of history that would have been lost if someone didn't actually go through the effort of going through all those old newspaper reports, going through all those old letters and writing it down. So once the book is published, we'll certainly share where people can find it, but I would really encourage people to have a look at this.
Well, it sounds fascinating. I had, honestly, even as a historian of South African history, I did not know the ties ran that deep with Hungarians and South African community. That's pretty amazing to hear. You know, when we talk about minorities and minority rights, I think it's important for a civilized people to respect all groups, particularly minorities, because they're at a disadvantage from a power standpoint. In this country, we established a system, far from perfect, but we established a system that would ensure against or protect against the tyranny of the majority. People love the term democracy, but democracy is little more than the tyranny of the majority. 50 plus 1 decide what 49.9 have to endure. And I don't think that's legitimate. That's not fair. So we came up with a system which includes electoral college so that we don't have a tyranny of the majority. But when it comes to minorities, there's a very poignant statement that Thucydides wrote in that was written in Thucydides. It was from the Malian Dialogue, a small island in the Aegean in which the Athenians went and wiped out. And in that, at the end, the poor Malians were left weak. And it says, since you know as well as we do, the right, as the world goes, is only in question between equal power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must.
The weak suffer what they must.
Yeah,
yes.
The Malian Dialogue, a very famous statement there. And sadly, that has been the history of humankind. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. Ethnic minorities often find themselves in a very weak position vis-a-vis political power and control. But it is interesting in Romania, just as I digress from that statement, I want to get back to it, but the current president, of course, is an ethnic German from Hermannstadt or Sibiu, and that is Klaus Janus. Of course, they've Romanized his name. It's Klaus Johann, but it's Janus now. So the importance of protecting minority rights. János, this is something the United Nations has enshrined, but has failed to do. It's in the United Nations Charter. It's listed, the right to self-determination, the right to protect minorities. It's all there, and that's supposedly the international norm. But we live in a Westphalian system of states in which it's anarchic international political system. And we see again and again, whether it's the Rohingya in Myanmar, the Uyghurs in China, or a whole host of other folks who are oppressed or marginalized by government authorities. How important is it now, from your perspective, János, with Hungarians being a minority in all these surrounding states and a majority only in their home country of Hungary, how important is it for states to recognize minority rights and protect their culture and their heritage from oppression?
Well, it would be, firstly, very important. Secondly, those countries that are countries where the people are living in minorities abroad, especially ones who are ancient minorities, should also be doing something. I mean, I'm thinking of Germany especially. Now, you mentioned earlier on these laws of the Sudetendeutschen being expelled from Czechoslovakia. Well, those laws also apply to the Hungarians in what's today Slovakia. And believe it or not, these laws are still enforced today. And the reason for them being enforced today is because these governments don't want to give compensation to these people or the people who are their heirs, because otherwise they'd have to return the land that they didn't. I mean, in 2021, there was a court case of, you can expropriate land in the government if it's in the public interest, but you have to pay the market value, obviously. And they were building some highway in Slovakia, and there was a person whose land would have had to be expropriated, who was a Hungarian, and the government didn't want to pay because of these laws. So it's, and then you think about, well, we're talking about this UN Charter, we're talking about the European Union, how can this happen? And I actually don't understand it. Now, you mentioned the president of Romania. For Hungarians, this person, and probably also for Germans, this person was, we had a lot of hopes in him, and we lost all hope because he didn't really do anything.
Yeah.
He didn't do anything regarding minority protection. In fact, he was worse than anybody else because he wanted to prove that to the Romanian government that he's the right person for the job. And the right person for the job, according to the majority, is that you have the minorities as scapegoats, because this is actually what's going on. And one interesting thing which I wanted to do and I couldn't do because unfortunately YouTube deleted these videos, or at least deleted one of them. Last December, there was a Romanian member of the Romanian parliament who was screaming and shouting at the top of her lungs saying that Hungarians should go home from Romania. Then the next thing that I wanted to cut this and add Julius Malema screaming at the top of his lungs that the Afrikaners should go back to Europe, and Jan van Riebeck overstayed his visa. As far as I know, he only stayed like 50 years or something.
Listen, it's very easy to overstay your visa under the ANC. I was nearly accused of that recently.
Yeah, but you probably heard these statements. So I wanted to make a video compilation of that. Unfortunately, the raw footage of the Romanian MP disappeared off the internet, but it was you probably still can find it if you really look hard. I just didn't have enough time for that. So what I'm really saying is that it will be very important because, as I said, here in Hungary, it's a prime example that if you work together with minorities and you guarantee them their rights and you give them the protection, I'm talking about lingual and cultural minorities. I'm not talking about self-proclaimed minorities. Because, stating that you are whatever is a self-proclaimed minority. So, in these lingual and cultural minorities, if you protect them and if you use these minorities to enrich your culture, for example, because many Transylvanian Hungarians say we learned a lot from the Saxons because they weren't being oppressed during the times of the Kingdom of Hungary. Now look at it. I mean, you said it in such a way that they got the exit visa and so on. Well, I personally consider this human trafficking with state aid. Because, I mean, they were selling their people.
I do not disagree, and it did not help the German economy because most of the people that were allowed to go were pensioners. So they were a burden for German taxpayers. It was a way for Ceausescu to raise money, and the German government was complicit in it.
Yeah, well, this is why I say it was a complete trade, and a similar situation happened in the 1950s with the Jews in Romania, by the way.
Yeah.
So they were sold off to Israel.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I add something to that? Just to get to your back to your question and your point about democracy. So democracy is like ice cream. Everyone likes it, or everyone claims to like it. But the problem with this whole discussion about democracy is the question remains: what do you actually mean when you say democracy? Because democracy can mean many things, and unfortunately, democracy, or our conception of democracy, has, or the modern conception of democracy at least, has been hijacked to the extent that the only acceptable way of thinking about democracy is liberal democracy, a democracy that only recognizes individual rights, that does not recognize groups, tradition, culture, and all of these things, or in as far as it does recognize them, it would say that these things are less important. And so this brings in the point about majoritarianism that was mentioned as well, is and I know in Hungary the infamous term liberal democracy or illiberal democracy was used, for which Viktor Orban has gotten quite a lot of criticism. I often say that there's a difference between what you might call natural democracy and artificial democracy or unnatural democracy. And natural democracy is a very old concept. It's an ancient concept or a traditional concept, and that just means that a community comes together and they decide who their leaders are, and the leaders represent the community. And this is very healthy and it's perfectly natural. But this modern conception of democracy is increasingly becoming a conception of democracy that says that the community that is the biggest get to decide who their leaders are, and their leaders will then rule over other communities and determine for other communities what their children should be taught in schools, how they should celebrate their culture, what they should know and what they should say about history. So and so forth. So the very sad point where we are now in the year 2024 is that democracy, or at least the way we are told we have to think about democracy, has become a tool for oppression of minority communities. It is not democracy anymore. This way of thinking is majoritarianism. Whoever gets the most votes gets to decide what the others have to do, what they have to think, what they have to say, and so forth. And that goes back to that old metaphor of two wolves and a lamb voting what's for dinner. It's perfectly normal for sheep or lambs to get together and decide who their leaders are. It's perfectly normal for wolves to get together, if we stick to the metaphor, and decide who their leaders are. But it's not natural and it's not normal for two wolves and a lamb to get together and then to vote on what they're going to have for dinner.
Well, that's exactly the point that I was getting at there. Majoritarianism, that's tyranny of the majority is what it is. And it's not fair to folks. You know, it's interesting, Ernst, you talk about this topic. The political left for years now has celebrated, well, fakely celebrated, not genuinely, the importance of diversity. But isn't it odd that particularly leftists in South Africa don't care about diversity? When a group which under South African Constitution has the right to assert its culture and its heritage and its language and protect them, but the majority in South Africa, much of the majority, doesn't really believe in diversity. They believe in supremacy. And it's quite a frightening prospect. It's not just there. It's the same thing in America, but it's not along ethnic lines. It's along political lines. People do not believe in genuine diversity. You know, here it's always, well, I've got a gay, I've got a black, I've got a yellow, I've got a white, I've got a green, I've got a Christian, I've got a Muslim. That's not diversity. True diversity is diversity of thought and diversity of experience. And diversity of experience comes from cultures, and it can be a strength. But, you know, I find it fascinating, this leftist drumbeat of diversity. But particularly in South Africa, as a minority, when you want to stand up for, you know, diversity, you know, be quiet, go sit in the corner. We don't want to hear what you have to say because, you know, you're oppressors.
It's the same in Hungary, because if you listen to, for example, the left and you listen to what they say, well, in Hungary there's no democracy, and then you ask yourself the question why. And well, this morning we found out, because according to the European Union, the only reason why they don't stop the some 7 paragraph or whatever thing against Hungary from the European Union is because they doesn't have a left-wing government. So basically, according to them, democracy means that the left has to be on power, and that's it, according to them. But I don't think that's democracy. I mean, we've heard this. People's democracy was called communism.
It's craven political power is what it is. But Ernst, you know, in South Africa, I mean, if you're a Tswana, if you're a Bakwena, and you want to celebrate your Tswana culture, you should be allowed to do that. Under the Constitution, you are. And if you're an Afrikaner, you should be allowed to do the same. And you shouldn't be a target because of that. I mean, let me get your thoughts on this, because you are an ethnic minority in a country with a very unusual history in which for a period of time a minority ruled over majority, but now the minorities are the ones that are on the opposite end of the spear, and it's not always pretty.
Yeah, and just to add to your examples, if a Zulu community have their own village. They have a traditional community where they live. People would celebrate that and say it's a traditional Zulu community and it's a good thing. But when Afrikaners get together and they say we want to start our own cultural community, which has been developing in South Africa, it's called Orania. People don't say, oh, it's an Afrikaner cultural community. They say, oh, it's a whites only enclave, or it's some racist project or something like that. So it just goes to this double standards. And this links to your comment about diversity. I think diversity is a phase one move of by the left, almost like the National Democratic Revolution we have in South Africa, where phase one is pretending to be liberal, pretending to be democratic until you get power, and then when you get the power, you start implementing socialist policies. And this diversity thing is also, it's just a one-way thing. So if you go to England, as it was, people would say, the argument would be, well, there's not enough diversity, there's too many white people, we need more diversity. But I've never, or France or Germany. So it's just getting fewer white people, getting fewer, and it's not just about being white. It's there's this very strong anti-Western drive behind this whole thing.
Anti-Christian as well.
Yes, exactly. Anti-Christian, anti-Western. So you won't find people going into Baghdad saying, well, what this place needs is more diversity. You won't find people going into Rwanda or some of these African
countries. Southern Baptist in Rwanda.
Or saying in the Congo, well, we're a bit concerned because there's not enough white people here. You need to get in more white people to have more diversity. It's only one way. It's only a one-way streak, and we see that in South Africa. For example, with the rugby team, the Springboks, is white and black people in the team, and there would be complaints that, oh no, it's not diverse enough. There's too many white people. The South African soccer team, Bafana is 100% black. So sometimes there would be a white player, but most of the time it's a 100% black team. And no one is saying, well, what this team needs is diversity.
Well, I do.
The team is celebrated for being, at least in these quarters, the team is celebrated for being a 100% black team. Yep. It's something to be celebrated. And then all of a sudden, diversity is not a priority anymore. So that's why I say diversity is sort of a phase one move. And once you get to this diverse situation, then you start pushing out the Christians and the Westerners and white people by implication, and then suddenly diversity is not important anymore.
No, that's absolutely the case, and there's actually a pushback. Now, the problem for years is that we've become wussified in the West. We've become wusses as society. We are terrified of being called a racist or a bigot when simply asserting who you are and what you're all about is not racist. It's not bigotry. Now, when you take actions against another group, then we can talk about racism and bigotry. But when you're simply trying to be who you are, that is not that. But too many people are afraid of being called a bigot and a racist. I mean, look, I understand it's very powerful. That little self-loathing hate wanker who targeted me during the Rugby World Cup when I was having daily discussions with Nas Bota about the World Cup because it wasn't broadcasting. And then this clown went to Supersport and whined and said, oh, how do you let your broadcaster associate with a white supremacist, a Klan member, and this Wyatt guy, I mean, and it worked. Suddenly Nas and I were no longer doing conversations. So I understand why people are fearful. But if you don't stand up for what's right, moral, and just when it matters, then you'll be like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. When they came for the communists, I was silent. When they came for the socialists, I was silent. When they came for the gays, I was silent. When they came for the mixed race Germans, I was silent. When they went for the aristocrats, I was silent. And when they came for me, there was no one left to defend me. And that's the bottom line. Leftists don't care about people. Look at the ANC. I mean, I just covered the story again today. I pulled up a 2004 Al Jazeera article, which was originally written by AFP, Agence France Presse, the French press agency, but published by Al Jazeera, exposing Tokyo Sexwale, Patrice Motsepe, Cyril Ramaphosa, and a whole host of other corrupt senior ANC political officials who were gifted equity and wealth and didn't earn it. That's 20 years ago, almost to the day. In April of 2004, the story that continues to this day. These people don't care about black South Africans. They don't care about the average guy. They care about craven political power, self-enrichment, and self-aggrandizement. And that is the problem we face here in the United States, all over the world. I think Hungary might be an exception. We're not having to deal with that, but you're dealing with it in Germany. You're dealing with it in South Africa. It's very frustrating for me, Ernst, to listen to this nonsense and the cowardice of people who are unwilling to step forward and be honest and be forthright and tell the truth, because eventually there'll be no place for them at the table and no place in society. They will be pushed aside and marginalized and eliminated. That is ultimately the goal of leftists. All they want is power. Would you agree or disagree with that statement?
Yeah, no, it's definitely the case. I remember when I spoke in Parliament in South Africa about expropriation without compensation, I concluded by saying that they are drunk on ideology, and of course that didn't go well with some of the members of Parliament. But that really is what's happening here. Is these people are so consumed by ideology and by these dreams about some utopia that we're going to arrive at in the future if we just destroy all the things that people held dear for thousands of years, if we destroy Christianity and if we destroy our Western values and heritage. And sometimes a lot of people don't realize that they're taking part in this. They would say, well, no, I'm a Christian, but I agree with this policy. But that's the core of what it is. It's as DC Schindler said, it's what these new modern ideologies are doing is they're flipping the hierarchy upside down. The hierarchy used to be for thousands of years that you as an individual, you are small. There are things out there that are bigger than you, that are more important than you, such as God at the top of the hierarchy, your tradition, your heritage, the things that you inherited from your ancestors. These things are more important than you as an individual. These modern hierarchies are flipping, or modern ideologies have flipped the hierarchy. They are saying that you as an individual, you are the most important thing. And you can then decide what matters, and you can even decide what reality is. If you decide that you are a Christian, then God exists. If you decide that you are an atheist, then he doesn't exist. If you decide, and now we've gotten to these extreme cases where if you decide that you are a cat, then you are a cat. Can
I pick my pronouns?
yeah, exactly. And if others don't recognize you as a cat for deciding that you are, then they are oppressing you. And it's this crazy, ludicrous point where we've gotten. And this is what it's about. It's people who have been become so consumed by ideology in the hope that there will be some future utopia at some point down the road if we just keep destroying things. But this utopia is not arriving. Instead, what is happening is levels of mistrust is increasing, levels of friction in communities, levels of violence. All of this is increasing. We're not getting to the point where things are getting better as a result of these ideologies. It's just becoming worse.
No, absolutely worse. Well, in Hungary, of course, the leader is Orbán, and he's taken a lot of flack from the European Union, János. He's been attacked by the European Union. Of course, Hungary, when Angela Merkel invited the criminal alien invasion of Central Europe, Hungary put up fences to stop this nonsense and being flooded by people who have no business being there, who are not genuine refugees, or they've already reached a safe harbor in Turkey or Greece. They shouldn't be in Hungary. But the Hungarian government is in some ways a pariah for Brussels. I don't know your thoughts, János, but if I was considered a pariah by Brussels, I'd carry that as a badge of honor these days.
Well, I don't really care about what they say, but I have to add, we do have this problem in Hungary. You said we don't. Well, we actually do, because we do have about, I think, 8 left-wing parties. The only thing is people don't vote for them. Well,
that's
not
good.
Quite true. Not quite true, because unfortunately we have a liberal mayor in Budapest. And I remember when I was taking Ernst to the airport, we were in a coffee shop, and I couldn't park next to the coffee shop, even though it was a Saturday, because he made sure that he closed enough parking spaces that we have congestion anyway. It was a 20-minute walk to get to the place where I parked my car, and it was 25 minutes to get my car back. So you can imagine how left-wing politics works. Now, the thing is, with the other area we have it is on the international front. For example, being called a racist for not letting the migrants through the border. Now, we actually do let anybody through the border. Ernst experienced it. The only way is you have to go through a border crossing through a legal way. Unfortunately,
I went through the border just the other day.
No. Yeah. Look, you guys are just clearly bigots. I mean, we allow millions of people to just walk across the Rio Grande. We give them free plane rides from Texas to Albany to Harrisburg. Get with the program. Come on, guys.
Chris, if you would see that border area, you have farms on the border. Yeah. If you own a farm there, you don't want people trampling through your crops.
Yeah, and leaving their refuse all over the place and stealing things from you. This is a problem we have in Texas and Arizona. Ranchers, their property is invaded and criminal damages take place.
And I mean, the guy we met on the other side of the border in Serbia was telling us that they were shooting at each other 50 meters from his house. And I
Wow,
mean, you know, you
sounds,
don't
maybe
want
János-
sounds like Pretoria.
I wanted to tell the story now, but János, I think you will be able to tell it better. Just talk a little bit about what we were told when we were at the border, the situation there with the passports being thrown down, the amount of people who went through the border, the people occupying the forest there. Just give us an overview of that, because I think that'd be useful for the viewers.
Yeah, well, basically, this person, he was the local Calvinist minister, told us that, well, first of all, they had AK-47s. Now, first question is, where does somebody get an AK-47s from? And he passed through I don't know how many countries, so that's the first point. Then the next thing is what they were doing is they were shooting at each other, but they weren't shooting between the locals and the migrants. You actually had like the Afghans and the Pakistanis and the Indians and whoever else were there shooting at each other. Now, I also have to add, I don't know about any war in Pakistan or India, for that matter, or in Turkey, because you also had Turkish citizens. He also said there were passports lying around all over the place because they threw their passports away and crossed the border, so they couldn't identify them, and they would just say they're from Syria. And they were all born on the 1st of January, whatever year, I don't know, they make sure they're a minor. Now, some of them were apparently over 50 years old. You could see it on their face. And they said that they're a 17-year-old minor because then they get different treatment according to regulations of the European Union. You can't lock them up, for example. Now, I don't understand why you can't lock somebody up for trespassing the border. If somebody climbs over the fence here and I find them in my yard, I'm going to call the police for them to get locked up if I didn't let them in.
Well, I may need to restock my ammunition stockpile if that happens on my property.
So, and it was all about, he also said that in the forests, in the border area, they were walking, just to have a walk in the forest, and some guy actually stopped them and told them, no, this is Afghan territory and you can't come in.
Well,
and he was standing there with an AK-47.
János, you see the backdrop where I'm at. Just go a few meters and in the opposite direction from where I'm at, and you won't be able to practice English common law. You'll have to be subjected to
I've noticed
Sharia.
that when I was there in 2017. So, yeah.
Sharia. It's crazy. Hey, listen, Ernst, before we wrap up here, you're talking about minorities and talking about governments. The theme of this was talking about the impacts of communism.
So can I just
go ahead, János. Go ahead.
Add one more sentence to it. The thing that the guy actually told us, the biggest problem is that the Europeans are losing their faith and letting in the Muslims who have a very strong faith. And it's not about economics, and partially the problem is that people are not reproducing themselves. And partially that some European people, especially in Germany, don't want to do certain jobs that are too dirty for them, like, I don't know, pack stuff on a truck and stuff like that. That's one of the problems. But the other problem that's gone too far now is that people have lost their faith in God. And this is why this is happening. Because if we'd have a strong faith and say, listen, guys, if you come here, you follow our rules, our customs and traditions, you don't do your singing the muezzin at night, because I've had an experience, the sun comes up pretty early in summer here. And when this whole migrant thing was just nearby where I live, you had somebody doing the muezzin because they have to do it before the sun comes up. Now, we're not exactly interested to be woken up by that stuff. So I just want to add.
If I could just add, and then also what they told us is that some of these migrants would go to these, especially Western European countries, and they say, well, these Europeans don't believe in anything. So there's this vacuum in terms of belief. And so they bring in their own religions and traditions and so forth. There's not really something to assimilate to put it that way. So you just bring in your own stuff. And then the locals have to assimilate with the immigrants, not the other way around.
Well, I would argue that Europeans aren't losing their faith. They lost their faith. I first arrived in Europe in 1984 and traveled throughout Central Europe. And I would visit historic churches and even go churches on Sundays. And they're virtually empty, virtually empty. Things are so bad that the German government has to pass a law stealing money from people who are Christians to give to churches, which makes the churches a tool of the state. No one is allowed to use church services and tithe voluntarily. If you're a member of a church, the government taxes you and gives part of that money to the church and keeps the rest. Europeans lost their faith a long time ago. They're godless, many of them, and this is a major problem. And it's why they're so pliable and so easy to manipulate into this nonsense of multiple pronouns and pink hair and all this lunacy taking place in Europe here. And idiots like Angela Merkel welcoming millions of fraudulent immigrants. They're not immigrants. You know, Germany, when I last lived, well, not when I last lived there, when I lived there in the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, Germany had a black population of roughly 50,000 out of 80 million people. 50,000. Okay, those 50,000 were a combination of some Africans who had moved to Germany because they're doctors and lawyers and specialists, a handful of them, plus the majority of them were actually mixed race offspring of British and American soldiers who grew up in Germany to German mothers, or the other way around, usually it's the mother. 50,000. There are Afro-German papers and news outlets today. There are 800,000, 100 million black Germans. There's no such thing as a black German. You can't be a black German. You can be German. You can be mixed race German, with parentage that comes from both sides, but you cannot be a black German. It does not exist. Schwarzkopf is a hair brand for shampoo. It is not an ethnicity. This is lunacy. Over a million people. Now, that is not bigotry. That is not xenophobia. That is not racism. That is a statement of fact. And that is how Germany is being changed. The culture, the norms, the mores, the values disappear. Germans, one of the traits about Germany is if you go to a forest, my goodness, you can't even find a leaf on the ground. The Germans are very anal about their forests. They maintain them very seriously. It's almost to the point where it's ridiculous. Whereas in most of the world, you wander to a forest, there's tree limbs that have fallen over, there's leaves here, this, that, and the other. But there'll come a time when the German forests are no longer maintained. When the German culture traditions
Berlin is
are gone.
full of trash today.
Yeah.
Berlin is full of trash. Now, I just want to add to it, Hungary is in Europe, and we haven't lost our faith. In fact, we're regaining it right now.
Well, you're an exception.
But let's hope that this starts spreading.
Well, it's it needs.
The big difference is, of course, those who were east of the Iron Curtain as opposed to west of the Iron Curtain.
Right, who were denied their faith and have rediscovered it since the end of it. Same thing in Russia with a lot of people because the Orthodox Church was oppressed so badly. Ernst, let me before we wrap up, I want to get back to this. If you look at South Africa, because the theme was communism here, we're talking about the impact of minorities. The Tripartite Alliance, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, the South African Communist Party, and the ANC, they are the same fellow travelers. The leadership of these parties was inculcated and educated and raised in the Soviet Union, in the German Democratic Republic, which wasn't democratic, in Cuba, in communist China. That's where they got their values from. That's where their belief system came from. And for a long time, many people, including myself, hoped that this generation of fossils would eventually die off and leave. But what we've seen is somehow their ideology in a corrupted fashion, not even a pure, Marxist fashion, has percolated down to those in their 20s, 30s, and 40s who are aspiring to be ANC leaders today. And this is a very bleak future for South Africa unless these clowns are removed from office at the ballot box. This is a situation in which you have a kleptocracy full of pseudo-Marxists who don't care about minorities, who don't care about rights, who care about craven political power, and the strong will do what they can, and the weak must suffer their fate. That is the future of South Africa unless people go to the ballot box on May 29th and make a change, and particularly white South Africans and colored South Africans who tend to be very apathetic when it comes to voting. It's time to get off your bums and get to the polling stations. Any thoughts or comments on that, Ernst?
Yeah, so three things. The first is that this tripartite alliance, as they call themselves, the ANC, the Communist Party, and COSATU, the Communist Trade Union Federation, you might say, they, of course, presented themselves, as I mentioned earlier, in the 90s as very liberal, very freedom-loving, very democratic. And now in South Africa, we have more than 100 race laws. So we have this joke where we say, they tried to convince us that they are the tripartite alliance, but in fact, they are the tri-apartheid alliance. So they are trying to implement apartheid now. And so that's the one thing. And then the other, I think I made a video about this. What the South African government is trying to do is very similar to what you might call the Cuban strategy. So the Cubans took over, Castro took over, they had their revolution, and they just started expropriating stuff. They started over-regulating. They just took as much as they can. They had this whole anti-Western thing, getting rid of the Westerners, of the whites and whatever. And then the Cuban strategy was basically just implement communism as much as you can, and then go to Russia and China and ask them to bail you out and try to get these countries to, just to give you more money. And so South Africa seems to be trying to do the same thing. They it was argued in Parliament and other places where people would say, well, can you at least recognize that this expropriation without compensation is going to lead, or is already, even the threat thereof is leading to a problem for the economy with property prices declining and so forth. And those who are honest enough would say, well, we don't care, because if the Westerners leave, then China will come in and China will pick up the bill. And so that's they're just hoping to be bailed out. And I think they know that they're destroying the economy. They don't care, because as long as and so there's this debate, which I think is very interesting, but also important, is how ideological is the ANC really? I mentioned earlier that they're drunk on ideology, but the other side of the coin is maybe they've gotten to the point now where it's not about ideology anymore. It's just about clinging to power as long as they possibly can. So it's almost a parasitic thing, just trying to hold on to power as long as they can, taxing people as much as they can, and then hoping that China or whoever will bail them out. And then we do have the third point is we have this interesting phenomenon that you mentioned, where the most radical people in South Africa did not experience apartheid. They are young, and they are not poor. They are young, middle class, or young, wealthy, urban black people, you might say. People who vote like the typical EFF people. The EFF isn't really a party for poor people who live in townships. It's a party for students studying at UCT and WITS and so forth. And so I think there's something important about this, which underlines back to the ideology, that it's an ideological movement, and that it's not so much for them about uplifting the poor and all of these things. If you really wanted to uplift the poor, at some stage you would have to concede that maybe just attempting for the government to own everything is not the best way to uplift the poor. And so this is very concerning. But I have to add that people who think like that are still in the minority. That if you spend time in South Africa, if you go to a shopping mall or you walk down the street and you are white and you engage with black people, you don't experience racism, and the other way around as well. But you do experience it if you go on Twitter. You see it all the time on social media, and you see it when you read the news. And then we have these commentators trying to convince us that South Africa is on the verge of a race war. I don't think South Africa is. I don't even think it's close to that. But what the problem in South Africa is that those who are in charge, those who have the power, are actively trying to encourage racial friction and friction between the different classes. And so the irony, or the joke, which is not really a joke, it's very unfortunate and sad, you might say, is in their own policy documents, the ANC describes their ideology, and then they would say, our ideology is a blend of race, nationalism, and socialism. Obviously, not knowing that the blend of race, nationalism, and socialism has been tried before, and the consequences weren't that good.
In Romania, for example.
Exactly. Well, that's one place, but it's fascinating when nationalism and racial nationalism was the order of the day in Nazi Germany. They were pariahs, but when the ANC does it, the world looks the other way. János, it's probably time to wrap up here. I want to thank both you guys for coming on and having this conversation, and also János for being able, since we weren't able to do this from Romania, still put your green screen up where we can actually see that church steeple there. What a tragedy that befell Romania in the 20th century under the communists, and before that, even when there was
what a tragedy for Hungary, by the way.
Well, yeah, I was getting to that. You're stealing my thunder, brother. I was getting to it. What a tragedy it befell Romania, and what a horrible tragedy befell all of Central Europe and Eastern Europe as a consequence of the actions of the Nazis in the Second World War and the aftermath and what's come of it. It's important, I believe, to protect minority rights, because minorities are Homo sapiens and humans, and we should have respect and love for other human beings. János, I'll give you a chance to share your thoughts with us to wrap up, and then we'll go to Ernst and we'll finish this thing. So János, any final thoughts about this conversation?
Yes, well, thank you for the opportunity. I think it's very important, as you said, to really look out for minorities. I mean, I just want to share one interesting experience about minorities. I was presenting the ethnic maps in Paris in 2022, and there was this Australian delegate who asked me, well, what's that area in the eastern part of the map? I told him that's Transylvania with the Hungarians. And that's when I realized that people are not actually aware of how many minorities live in the world. And I think this is something that our cooperation with the Afrikaners is starting to make the world aware that we exist. The Afrikaners exist, the Hungarian minorities exist. I mean, it was actually very interesting to realize that probably the most open people to this question I met who were not Hungarians was when I was sitting with Ernst on our first meeting near the opera in Budapest in that coffee shop. Which was not recorded in the documentary, but that was actually our first meeting, and I still can remember that day really well. So I personally think that we're going to have a very, very good cooperation, and well, I'm actually really grateful for you, Chris, for doing this thing of opening up to the world about South Africa, about the minorities, about everything. You know, don't forget that I had my experiences in South Africa. I grew up there. I saw everything, how it's declining, and quite often I feel that the situation in South Africa with the ANC is very similar to the situation of Romania in the 1980s, when Ceausescu was doing his ethno-communism. It was racist. They always needed a scapegoat. The ANC needs a scapegoat. And it always comes back. When things don't go well in a country that's not operating properly, usually left-wing countries, then you always need a scapegoat. And this is basically the lesson to learn from this. And I'm also really grateful for Ernst and Daniel that you came along to Transylvania, that you basically saw where I come from. And well, I think this is the way forward to cooperate, because if the minorities stick together, then we can have a voice. Then things can happen, and then we can get to the point where we're respected by the world and not say, oh well, you guys are minorities, who cares? We're the majority, and shut up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think America also needs to learn a few lessons from this, the way I see it right now. I mean, there were jokes made about this in Hungary when the BLM riots were, that it's called burn, loot, murder and stuff like that. But it's not a joke. And this can happen everywhere. And unfortunately, guys, please don't forget, when you look at Hungary, we do have our left. They're doing this mess. They've got a big voice because they've got lots of money, so they can make press companies for themselves. The only good thing is people are not voting for them, so don't vote for them. Nowhere in the world, just don't vote for them.
Well, sadly,
and don't elections be defrauded, like in some places it happens.
Sadly, in South Africa, people will vote for political left, and there's the offshoots of the ANC, the Mkhonto weSizwe Party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, and from way back in the day, COPE, but not much of a
Well, those are worse than the ANC. If I'd have to choose between those guys and the ANC
worse.
being in power, I don't think I ever would have said this 10 years ago. Then rather keep the ANC.
Well, János, hold your powder on that one, because after May 29th, we could very well see the Armageddon coalition between the ANC, MK, and EFF.
That would be a catastrophe.
Well, that's why I've termed it the Armageddon Coalition in my video analyzing potential coalitions after May 29th. All right, thank you so much, János. All right, Ernst, final thoughts and comments on our conversation here this afternoon.
Yeah, well, thank you. Firstly, to you, Chris, for having this conversation. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I also thank you to János. János has done some incredible work to help us know more and understand the Hungarian situation, and especially the situation in Transylvania better, and to put us in contact with so many people in Hungary and in Transylvania, including media interviews, including speaking at conferences, meeting politicians, members of parliament, and so forth. And I think for me, one of the big lessons or observations from this this last trip, that is important. We've seen it in South Africa, but we saw now that it's the case elsewhere in the world as well, is that we tend to think that communism or socialism or Marxism is merely about class struggle. And that's, in theory, that's the core of it, is it's a class struggle. That's at least what they say. But it's very clear that there's a very strong ethnic dimension to this. And it's obvious in South Africa, the jump from class struggle to race struggle it's a very easy jump to make, which is why leftists claim to be for helping the poor, and then they make the jump to hating people based on the color of their skin and trying to get rid of them and so forth. And this is what happened, and we saw it. it's really sad to go to the village, for example, where in the background there of János's picture, you see this incredibly beautiful area, you see the beautiful forests, and then you see this lake, which at first glance is beautiful, and then you realize it's not just an outstretch of water, it's a gravesite, because underneath that lake there is an entire village that was drowned, and you have this. I said to János while we were there, I had this feeling of standing at a grave, where in front of you there's a dead person, someone was buried here. There's below the soil there's a coffin, and in the coffin there's a dead person, and that's what you experience when you stand at this lake. It's incredibly beautiful. It's this paradox. You see the forest, and you hear the birds and the frogs, and you can hear the nature. And you know that what you're actually witnessing is the gravesite, and it's very important for people to know this. And it's very sad to see how countries who have not experienced this type of thing are now flirting with this type of thing, trying to implement the sort of policies that led to this type of thing. And I think people need to. The world would be better off if the Western Europe and America and the West in general were to take more cognizance of what is happening in South Africa and what has happened in countries like Romania, as we know today, and what happened in Hungary and those countries on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain.
Well, Ernst, thank you for good comments. But we don't want to end on a sour note. There are examples of ethnic minorities who survive and thrive in I don't want to say alien, but in a culture where they're definitely a minority. Examples of the Sorbian Slavs in Germany who survived centuries of Germanization to retain their distinctive cultural heritage and their language. We have Swedes in Finland. Of course, Sweden colonized Finland, but the Öland Islands is 90% Swedish to this day, and 6% of Finland is actually Swedish, and their rights are protected there. In addition, we have the Karelians who were forced to evacuate from Karelia when the Soviets invaded in the Winter War of 1939 and had become part of Finnish society, but retain their cultural distinctiveness. In Italy, we have Austrians in South Tyrol. I know this example that Ernst is familiar with because Ernst von Sale has also been there, went to visit that. I think Ernst von Sale was shocked to know that I knew so much about South Tyrol, where I used to get my newspaper from, the Dolomiten in German, every single day when I lived in Italy. Yep. And then, of course, in America, we have the Amish, who've retained their cultural and religious distinctiveness and ethnicity for centuries here. So it is possible to recognize and protect cultural rights of minorities and their language, and they can exist, but it takes tolerance. It takes legitimate governments that care about that. So I'd like to end it on a positive note like that. I want to thank both of my guests today, János Jeney from Hungary, via Transylvania, via South Africa, and Ernst Roets from South Africa. Thank you both very much. I look forward to future collaboration and talking more about these subjects. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I'll let both of you drop off, and I'll wrap up the broadcast here. We've got Bride Brews coming up at the top of the, well, not today hour, but the next one. So from Hungary, it's János, and from South Africa, it's Ernst Roets. Thanks a lot, gents. Take care.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. All right. So, folks, I hope that you found this interesting, this conversation, and useful, and hopefully illuminating. Just a moment there. I'll put him in there we go. So it's just me now. All right. Thanks a lot for being here. Really do appreciate it. Y'all take care. And we'll be back up at 12 o'clock Eastern Standard Time at 6 p.m. in South Africa for the Bride Brews with Byron Shepherd from Morning Shot and myself. We haven't done this in a couple of months while I was running for office. So we're going to talk about South Africa and what's going on there. Probably a little bit about America as well. And then later today, we have Dr. Corné Mulder, the chief whip for the Freedom Front Plus and a member of Parliament, the longest serving member of Parliament in South Africa. He's from the Freedom Front Plus. Be with us later today, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 8 p.m. South African time. Thanks a lot, folks, for your attendance, your participation in our broadcast today. We do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and we'll catch you here just in an hour and a half or thereabouts. Thank you so much. And once again, thanks to my guests who were fantastic. I really appreciate them being here. You all take care.